The governor of Russia's Kursk region says a drone has attacked an airfield, setting an oil storage tank on fire. The region borders Ukraine, and the incident comes a day after multiple explosions at two military bases deeper inside Russian territory. Moscow blamed Ukrainian drones for those blasts. Kyiv has not claimed responsibility. On Monday, Russia launched another wave of strikes against Ukrainian cities. President Volodymyr Zelenskyy says missiles killed at least 4 people and knocked out power in many parts. Ukrainian officials are warning several regions are now facing more emergency blackouts. Let's get more on this latest escalation in the war from Andras Rats. He's an analyst with the Security and Defence Programme in Budapest. First of all, tell us more about these blasts that Moscow blame on Ukraine. We're getting reports of further supposed drone strikes in Russia. What do you make of all of this?
Well, we need to differentiate between different targets and different blasts. The two blasts which occurred very far away from Ukraine's border at the Engels Air Base and the Yagilevo Air Base, these are two air bases deep inside Russia, where Russia is this is the home bases for Russia's strategic bombers, which are used against, which are used for the attacks against Ukraine. The attacks on these bases, even if they were done by Ukraine, Ukraine hasn't claimed responsibility. Even if the attacks were done by Ukraine and Ukrainian drones, then these drones would probably were launched from Russia by some Ukrainian special agents, special operations, because these bases are very far away from Ukraine's border. Ukraine doesn't have drones of that range. The very recent attack against the Kursk region, that was probably done by a Ukrainian drone launched from Ukraine. What these attacks means that Ukraine is clearly capable of hitting military targets deep inside Russia's territory, and the Russian bases neighboring Ukraine, the Russian bases in the regions which are neighboring Ukraine, are clearly in danger. In the long run, if these attacks continue, Russia is highly likely to withdraw its air forces to bases further away from the Ukrainian border, which might hamper the operation of Russian air forces.
But does this signal an escalation in this war, do you think, from these few attacks?
I'm not entirely sure about that. I mean, in the last 11 months of the war, or nearly last 11 months of the war, there have been several cases when Ukraine was able to attack Russian territory, not only the occupied Crimea, but also military bases inside Russia. So these attacks do not signal much of an escalation, either in terms of targeting or in terms of intensity. I don't think this is a sign of an escalation. I think this is more a sign that, of Ukraine's willingness to fight back and also hit deep Russian territory should Kyiv deem it necessary. But I don't see an escalatory pattern here.
OK, Andras, just let me play this next report because I want to ask you about Russia's launching of a new wave of missile attacks. On Monday, they caused widespread power outages and damages across the region to infrastructure.
Kyiv residents seeking shelter in the city's metro stations. It's not the first time they've had to flee underground for safety from Russian missiles. But the impact of these strikes is getting more severe as temperatures drop.
I hope there won't be mass destruction. The Russians waited until temperatures fell to 5-6 degrees Celsius, until it got cold. But we have blankets, sleeping bags, camping gas, and the metro. I believe we will endure it, even if they inflict some destruction today.
Ukraine's Air Force says it shot down more than 60 of the 70 missiles launched. President Volodymyr Zelenskyy hailed the defenders.
I want to thank the Air Defense Forces, our electrical engineers, and our people. The Air Defense Forces shot down most of the missiles. The engineers have already begun to restore electricity. Our people never give up. Glory to Ukraine.
Repeated Russian missile and drone strikes have targeted the power grid, leaving millions without electricity and heating. Ukrainians have resorted to wood stoves to fend off the cold. The Kremlin wants to weaponize winter to bring Ukraine to its knees.
This has been happening time and again over weeks now, using winter as a weapon. I mean, it all amounts to a war crime, doesn't it?
Most probably, yes. I mean, systematically attacking clearly civilian targets, it is something that can well be qualified as a war crime. This has actually been part of Russia's war-fighting strategy for a long time. I mean, attacking civilian infrastructure was an integral part of how Russia fought the first Chechen war, the second Chechen war, even its air campaign in Syria. So what Russian air forces are doing now, I mean, by attacking Ukrainian civilian infrastructure, on the one hand, it's a war crime. On the other hand, however, not much new, taking into account Russia's previous war, unfortunately.
Are there any other strategies that the Russians are going to be able to come up with? It sounds like they're quite desperate.
They seem to be quite desperate because the Russian ground forces have lost initiative on the front line already, like in late summer. So these systematic attacks against Ukrainian civilian infrastructure appear to be a strategy aimed at weaponizing the winter, and the Ukrainian winter is much harsher than the winter we have in Germany. So the strategy seems to be to weaponize the winter to break the morale of the Ukrainian civilian population. However, again, I mean, military history doesn't know too many examples when the morale of the civilian population could be broken solely by aerial bombing. So here I share the optimism of President Zelenskyy. I think Ukrainian population will endure.
Andrzej Rach of the Security and Defence Programme in Budapest, thank you very much for giving us your analysis.
Thank you.
Nick Connolly is our correspondent in Kyiv. Nick, Ukrainian drones are reported to have hit 2 Russian air bases in its territory. That'd have the potential to escalate things. What do we know exactly?
Well, since yesterday, we have seen a whole lot more in terms of images of the damage done. Initially, we just had, kind of CCTV footage from nearby buildings, of a bang. We saw big flame on the night sky in Ryazan, one of those bases, and since then we've had pictures of the damage also from the sky, from satellites, seeing from above what was done, the explosion of that petrol tanker and signs of also damage to some of the crews there. And now in the last few hours this morning there seems to have been another attack on Russian territory, this time somewhat close to the Ukrainian border, the city of Kursk, about 100 kilometers away from Ukraine's frontiers, which is still a lot deeper inside Russia than has been kind of the norm through this war, where mostly basically kind of 20-30 kilometers deep into Russia, cities like Belgorod, close to Kharkiv, have seen Ukrainian retaliation. So this does seem like a real change in gear. It seems like Ukraine now capable of doing this. We'd heard yesterday evening from the Russians that they thought this was a Soviet drone, which immediately didn't kind of really make sense. It wasn't something that kind of computed. And now it seems that potentially there is room for the Ukrainians to have rebuilt, re-engineered, as it were, a Soviet surveillance drone that basically is redundant now because the electronics and the optics just aren't up to modern standards. You have kind of commercial satellites, and basically turn that drone into a kind of kamikaze drone that then takes explosives deep into Russian territory, but with kind of a good engine, as it were. Obviously, this is all unconfirmed, but it does sort of seem to make sense to lots of experts in the field. But obviously, all the more embarrassing for Russia that it is unable to destroy and detect drones that it itself built 30, 40, 50 years ago, and that they're able to fly so deep into Russian territory unnoticed and unstopped, especially as some of those bases hit yesterday. Those are places where Russia bases its nuclear deterrent. So these are kind of as strategic as sites as they get, and that is not something that Russia is able to properly defend, is something that's going to be obviously very worrying and very embarrassing to Vladimir Putin.
And President Volodymyr Zelenskyy says Ukraine shot down most of the missiles Russia fired yesterday, but the latest barrage still caused serious damage, I guess.
That's definitely the case. I think it really depends where in Ukraine you are. Here in the capital, Kyiv, obviously the defences are a little better, so there was less in the way of hits, especially in Kyiv city. Some of the outages of power seem to have been a kind of precaution by the Ukrainian authorities to prevent further damage, basically drawing the systems down, switching them off temporarily while those missile attacks were being expected. And in lots of places they were able to then restart them relatively quickly. But in places like Odessa and Mykolaiv in the south of Ukraine, close close to the sea, those outages are still continuing, and it has been said by experts that it is just a lot more difficult because they are close to the sea. It's much more difficult to detect drones and obviously missiles or any kind of attack over the sea. Just fewer radar installations there. So basically, it's easier to surprise Ukraine's defenders and Ukraine's anti-aircraft systems in regions by the sea. But I think broadly, every time we have these attacks, Ukraine is able to knock more of these missiles out of the sky and recover slightly faster. So there is definitely progress there.
Nick Connolly, thank you very much for the reporting from Kyiv.